the challenging ways in which you relate to yourself is a mirror of how mom treated you or how
Mm.
dad treated you. So a lot of the ways in which we sabotage or our inner judge or our inner critic, our perfectionist, those are all of the ways in which our parents related to us. And then we take on the persona of those archetypes in how we relate to ourselves. So I think the prerequisite to being a healthy, conscious parent to any child is to be the parent to your inner child that the child inside of you still so desperately needs. Because if you haven't yet done that, then you're going to project all of those unresolved wounds outward onto the next generation. This is why you see patterns repeat themselves generation after generation.
Greg Schmaus, welcome. Welcome to the Holistic OBGYN podcast. You came highly recommended from a couple mutual friends of ours, namely Kyle Kingsbury, Paul Check. Let's get into some of the archetypal work. We talked a little bit. I gave you some vague questions beforehand. It was like, what can we explore? And you sent me this incredibly beautiful list of insights as to what you do within the let's call it the archetypal work. You've already kind of touched on it a little bit, but how do you approach this conversation around archetypes? Why should we care about archetypes? And by the way, that title of the book, King, Magician, Warrior, what's the fourth one? King, Magician,
Lover.
Warrior, Lover. Those are
Uh-huh.
four archetypes of the masculine. So
Yeah.
for anybody who's wondering, that's what the title of that book is about. It gets really in depth on some of these things. Why don't you start by, I'm a total stranger to archetypal work, and I have no idea what you're talking about. What are we talking about here?
So archetypes are really the vehicles that we use to express ourselves,
Mm.
right? So if you take like king, warrior, magician, lover, those are the four male archetypes that we all consciously or unconsciously step into.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what we're going to talk about today are the survival archetypes, which are the ones that we all have,
Yeah.
whether you're a man or a woman. We all have survival archetypes. And these are the archetypes or the roles that we play that allow us to ensure safety, security, and survival. What a lot of people don't actually know is the king, warrior, magician, lover actually matches up perfectly with the four survival archetypes. The king and the child go together. The warrior and the victim go together. The saboteur and the magician go together. And the prostitute and the lover go together. So,
Hmm.
a lot of the shadow expressions of those four male archetypes, for example, the immature king is carrying a lot of the wounded child, right? The immature warrior is taking victims or is victimizing self or other. The unhealthy expression of the magician is full of the saboteur because the saboteur is all about illusion and deception.
Right. Right.
And then the
Hmm.
prostitute and the lover, the prostitute is what we do in the name of love, but might be more from a place of safety, security, self compromise, or negotiation.
Right. Right.
So the truth is that all of these archetypes are really our relationship with our own power.
Oh, I
All
love that.
archetypes really relate to your relationship with your power. For example, when we play the victim, we play this powerless role as a way of feeling in control. For example, I'll give you a real life example. When I was a child, my dad was a physician, like Western medicine, orthopedist, and he and I never really had a deep emotional connection.
Hmm.
But when I was sick or when I was in pain, my mom would take me to his office and I would get the best treatment from him, his partners, his nurses. So the victim inside of me said, when I'm in pain or when I'm sick, I get more love from dad. I get more connection
Oh,
with my father. So the victim plays this powerless role almost as a power play to get its needs met, to feel more in control.
playing the sick
So,
role. Yeah. Yeah.
yes. So the saboteur is really our relationship with truth. The saboteur is what protects us from the truth that we don't want to look at. right? Whether it might be the truth that I don't like my job, or this relationship isn't serving me, or where I'm living is not serving me anymore. The saboteur always self-sabotages to keep the status quo because it's convenient and familiar, even though it's disconnecting us from truth and empowerment, right? So ironically, the 4 survival archetypes actually protect us from our own empowerment to ensure survival, which is kind of like an ironic thing. We disempower ourselves to ensure our survival. And these are all learned behaviors or patterns of adaptation that we developed as a child. Like, for example, the prostitute archetype is where we compromise, negotiate, sell ourselves, or prostitute others.
Yeah.
And when I explored this in myself, I remember when I was like 10 years old, my mom would give me like $10 to go to the movies and to go for ice cream with my friends. And I remember actually buying my friends movie tickets and then buying their ice cream when it wasn't my money. I didn't have a job, and there was no reason that I should do that or had to do that. But I remember looking back, what I was doing was I was buying their loyalty. I knew on some level that if I bought their movie ticket and their ice cream, that there would be a greater chance that they would stay friendly with me. And that's just like a 10-year-old's mind of actually stepping into the prostitute archetype.
Right.
Of using money, for example, as a form of manipulation.
Yeah.
As a form of trying to gain some sort of guarantee.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So these are all survival mechanisms that we develop as a child. And until we start to do the healing work, we always revert back to them during times of stress, which is why, like, times of pandemic is when you also see the survival archetypes on the forefront.
Yeah.
Because anytime that nervous system shifts into that fight or flight state, we always revert back to the old survival mechanisms, which are child, victim, saboteur, and prostitute.
Yeah, you had me thinking, and for some reason, Viktor Frankl came up, and probably because you had already kind of set that into motion with sort of the purpose we have. And the one quote that I always think about, and Viktor Frankl, for anybody who doesn't know, wrote a book called A Man's Search for Meaning. And of course, it's not a book about men. It's about the human experience and what we have control over and what we don't have control over. And the one quote that I always turn to is, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And when I think back to the things that we used to do when we were embodying these survival archetypes, it never feels good to look back and to realize how you were behaving. But in the moment we chose to do that, like you said, for the purpose of survival, it does make me thoughtful about if you remain in that survival archetype, you're really never embodying true power. You're never really doing the thing that is best for you. You're doing something to keep other people off your back. It's sort of like shoveling water out of the boat, but there's a giant hole in the bottom. And if you could just put your resources together to repair the hole, you wouldn't have to get this water out. But that's the survival mechanism that takes over when, really the best thing would be to, heal the boat, to patch that hole. What is it about our society that keeps people trapped? And I might be jumping ahead a little bit here, but first off, do you feel like a lot of people get trapped in some of these survival archetypes?
Yes, we all do at some point in our life.
Right.
And I think there's a few reasons why our culture has a hard time kind of shifting out of the shadow expression of them. I think number one is very simple. It's chronic stress.
Mm-hmm.
Like, our culture is chronically in a sympathetic state, in a fight or flight state.
Right.
So if your nervous system is in that state, you're always going to be in survival mode.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I love when Paul says, when you're running from a lion, it's not a good idea to throw in a cartwheel.
Yeah, right.
Which means also, like, when you're under chronic stress and you're running from the lion, so to speak, doing anything that's different, creative, new, or novel is actually a threat to your survival.
Right.
So actually making a change when you're in that sympathetic state is very difficult. I think there's
Right.
also a lot of kind of like old religious programming and kind of like residue that's kind of been carried with a lot of people, where actually looking at these archetypes brings up like a lot of guilt and shame.
Mm.
So any ability to like explore the parts of yourself that are like kind of dark or uncomfortable to look at, like there's a lot of guilt and shame, I think, derived from a lot of kind of like the mainstream like religious institutions, where we kind of shy away from looking at those parts of ourselves.
Sure.
So I think with that, there's some of that unwillingness as well. But in my own work, obviously, I'm biased because the people that are coming to me are the ones that are willing to look at those aspects of themselves. But one of the reasons that archetypes are really helpful for some of this work is because archetypes aren't personal. When
Yeah.
you explore the victim or the saboteur, if you know that, hey, everyone has a victim, everyone has a saboteur, it's a collective pattern that you're experiencing on an individual level, it becomes less of a personal thing, and therefore a little bit easier of like a barrier of entry of like, okay, I'm willing to explore this because this is not just me, we all have this.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
since archetypes are collective patterns, not personal things, it's a much more kind of like friendly language to use to explore these parts of yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the main reasons that I incorporate archetypal work within my practice is because a lot of people are coming to me after they've been through years of treatments within the medical establishment around getting pregnant. They want to have a baby and they're desperate to have a baby, but something's not clicking there. And one thing I'll have them do, so they don't want to use any more IVF. Maybe they can't even afford to do IVF, which is in vitro fertilization. You pump yourself full of all these synthetic hormones. You force the body to get pregnant, even if the body otherwise perhaps wouldn't be able to carry a pregnancy. And so they come to me and we start working, but they're really surprised that I don't start with lab work and all that other stuff. I actually ask them, the first question I ask is related to how you show up in the world. And a part of the first questionnaire, I actually ask them, which archetype do you currently embody? And which archetype would you ideally want to embody? And oftentimes they've never even heard about archetypes. And I will read, Jung's definition. The Jungian archetypes are defined as images and themes that derive from the collective unconscious. This is, of course, through Carl Jung, who was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud. Archetypes have universal meanings across cultures and may show up in dreams, literature, art, or religion. So it's somewhat vague, and it's actually pretty nebulous how you answer the question. If you do go to you look up a list of Jungian archetypes, you'll see that there's all different types and subtypes and everything else. But the way that people answer is often very interesting. And it oftentimes doesn't reflect that they've been thoughtful about this transformation that happens over 9 months of pregnancy. And then bam, in a moment, you are now expected to be a dad. The baby's out, you're now a dad. Whatever you thought you were before rapidly dissolves. And when I find that people are resistant to that dissolution of their former identity through this spiritual transformation that is childbirth, I find that they end up being ill-equipped, but actually they start to distance themselves from the experience because it's so confronting. So, one thing that we've talked a little bit about, and I know that you're not in birth work, but when you think about these transitions, what I always say is that you are dying in childbirth. You're leaving this old identity behind. You're assuming this new identity. Is there a way for somebody who, if they were working with you, what advice would you give them about utilizing this archetypal, I don't want to say strategy, this archetypal exercise in order to prepare themselves for any major transition in life, especially something as challenging and sacred as becoming a parent?
Yeah. So, I love the exploration of the mother and father archetype. And because that's one of your first introductions into archetypes is your relationship with your parents when you're a child. So you're in the child archetype and you're in relationship with mom and dad, the mother and father archetype. And this really sets the stage for how you mother yourself.
Right.
how you father yourself, how you parent the child inside of you. And I think that sets the stage for how you parent anyone else.
Mm.
So I think parenting your inner child and becoming the mother and the father to the child inside of you that you may have needed back then, but may have not received, I think that's one of the most important steps to take.
Hmm.
Because a lot of times what you realize is the challenging ways in which you relate to yourself is a mirror of how mom treated you or how
Mm.
dad treated you. So, a lot of the ways in which we sabotage or our inner judge or our inner critic, our perfectionist, those are all of the ways in which our parents related to us. And then we take on the persona of those archetypes in how we relate to ourselves.
Yeah.
So, I think the prerequisite to being a healthy, conscious parent to any child is to be the parent to your inner child that the child inside of you still so desperately needs. Because if you haven't yet done that, then you're going to project all of those unresolved wounds outward onto the next generation. This is why you see patterns repeat themselves generation after
Yeah.
generation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also, archetypally, the mother represents how you relate to your inner life, and the father represents how you feel received by the outer world. So if you take a look at your relationship with your mom, that very often relates to how you relate to parts of yourself, your inner life. And
Mm.
then if you take a look at your relationship with your dad, how you felt received by dad really sets the stage for how you think you're going to be received by the world. Right. So doing a lot of that mother and father archetype work to me is like the number one prerequisite to really embodying a healthy parent archetype to your own biological or adopted children.
Yeah. And I can imagine for a young child who is being parented by somebody who hasn't done some of this. It sounds basic, but it's actually quite hard because these are conditioned behavioral patterns in how we show up in the world and how we relate to others. I think it would be very confusing as a child to be cared for, let's say, by a father, because I will never be a mother, but to be cared for by a father who still has these wounds from that poor relationship I had with my father, perhaps. And it wasn't the worst relationship, but if I'm still vying for my father's love and attention, and I'm going to do things that are outside of the bounds of what I would consider integrity to myself, what is that how is that going to be received by a child who's looking at the world as an infinite realm of possibilities? And of course, then, if I project that onto my child, that's going to lead to attachment disorders, I presume, with my child. And neither of us are child psychologists, but this is well rooted in the work of Rudolf Steiner and the Waldorf
Mhm.
education program. Like during those 7 years, you need to really be showing up as the person that you want to be, an empowered individual, because they're looking for somebody to keep them safe,
Yeah.
to make them feel loved, to keep them safe, to show them boundaries. And if we haven't done that work for ourselves based on past wounds or relationships with our parents or whatever else, um, and if we stay in perhaps that victim mentality, we're merely going to be projecting those wounds onto this child. Like you said, they're going to grow up in those early years with this strange relationship with their dad because their dad hasn't found a way to embrace his own power. Um, I do think that this is a lot harder than perhaps we're making it sound. But I'm curious. Have you worked with anybody since you do so much work with archetypes? Have you met anybody in your work who actually has gone through this process, and how was it received?
One of the systems that I use with the archetypes is based on Caroline Miss's work. I've done a lot of professional training with her, and
Mm.
she uses what's called the 12 archetype wheel, which matches up with the 12 houses in
Oh yeah.
astrology.
Uh huh.
So, what I guide people through, and I do this with almost every client that I work with, is I help the client determine their 12 main archetypes. which are the 4 survival archetypes plus 8 individual archetypes.
Mm.
And then I take them through a process of casting the wheel so they start to see which archetype is showing up in which house. For example, the first house relates to your ego and personality. The second house relates to values, finances, self-worth, etc. The third house relates to communication and self-expression. Fourth house is home and family life, and it goes around. You have work and health, you have one-on-one relationships, you have spirituality, you have group relationships. So you have all of these different houses which relate to all of these different aspects of your life that you're in relationship with. So I allow the client to see which archetype is showing up in which house, which area of your life. And then I guide them in a process of starting to see the interconnectedness of the wheel where all of these archetypes are interacting with one another. For example, if I use my wheel as an example, in my ego personality, my first house, I have the healer.
Mm.
And then across from that, in the 7th house, in one-on-one relationships, I have the saboteur. So for me, my healer and my saboteur are very often engaging one another. It might be me showing up for someone else, trying to heal them at the expense of myself, right? That would be an example of the healer and the saboteur working together. Or in my 6th house, I have the hero, and across in my 12th house, I have the shapeshifter. And the hero is in my house of work. So there's a part of me that wants to be the hero in my work and save the day. So the shapeshifter steps in and says, like, okay, who does this person need me to be? I'll shapeshift into that so I can be their hero. So this archetype wheel almost creates like a blueprint of all of the archetypal patterning that you can see very clearly. And it's been like the most amazing framework to allow the person to just see very easily the patterns that have been going on for a long time that have been, patterns of adaptation, patterns of survival. But also it contains a lot of the light expressions. Like that's really what we want to step into, are the light expressions. I actually just did Mike Salemi's wheel like a couple weeks ago because he's having a kid in a couple months. Mm-hmm. And, I took him through this work and he was just like blown away by all of these patterns that were coming up that he was starting to be consciously aware of and how important that was for him prior to stepping into fatherhood. So to me, that's been like the greatest kind of like framework to use guiding a person through, is using that wheel itself.
Yeah. And I'm guessing, your partner, are you married? I can't remember.
Not married, no.
So your partner, she has 4 kids, is that right?
3.
3 kids. So you sort of were adopted into this family, so to speak. You're now having to embrace this, perhaps a very, very different role in your life compared to before having met her. Mm-hmm. What was that experience like for you? Like, I want to be very specific. Like, what, if you could look back and look at what archetypes were kind of being embodied in your life then, and then immediately having to switch, how did that change look for you?
For me, that process has been very much related to me stepping into my power and stepping into the father archetype, the warrior archetype, all of like the king archetype, the real kind of like masculine, more authority, leadership based archetypes. And, my partner, she's also a medical doctor, and she's, an incredibly hard worker, like incredibly passionate, highly developed. She's actually the one that introduced me to the archetype wheel. It's funny, we did my wheel the day that we got together for the first time. She jokes around that she just wanted to see what she was getting herself into. But those archetypes have really been showing me where I need to take more command in my life. I need to set better boundaries in my life. I need to be able to not be afraid of my own anger, not be afraid of the energy that, might hold a lot of passion, but in the past, I experienced it as more destruction. I
Wow.
used to be
Yeah.
afraid of my father's anger because sometimes it would get violent or I would hear things breaking in the house. So I would kind of like hide in my room, and I had this awareness of like, oh, like anger's not safe. But literally last night, like my partner and I were having a discussion because her daughter has special needs.
Mm.
And it's very challenging being in a relationship with a child with special needs, because you try and instill certain things or teach certain lessons, but you feel like it just like doesn't get through, and you see the same patterns repeating themselves over and over again. And there's been many times where she'll kind of act out and maybe get physically violent with my partner. And in the past, I've kind of like taken a step back and allowed them to work it out on their own. And then afterwards, take her daughter aside and kind of work with her myself. What was coming up for you? What was,
Wow.
what were some of the emotions? What were you experiencing? And my partner yesterday was sharing me, was like, look, that's not working anymore. Like, you need to take more of a masculine father figure approach of like, if she puts her hands on me, you need to set a boundary and say, that's not permitted anymore. Where it's almost like I was taking more
Wow.
of like the mother approach of like
Yeah.
being like the safe container for
Hold
each of
space for
them,
the process.
hold
Yeah.
space and
Yeah.
allow her to explore these parts of herself in like a safe space. But that was not the role. That was the role I played for a while, but now I'm in an archetypal transition of like, now I need to be the boundary setter. Now I need to like lay down the law.
Wow.
And that's very uncomfortable for me because of how I experienced that with my own father.
Because you're worried about you're worried about impressing upon somebody fear or whatever it was that you were experiencing when you heard your dad being the strong mountain and laying down the law, or however you want to word it. You don't want to impress upon them the same emotional experience that you recall from hearing him raise his voice or
Yeah.
whatever.
There's a part of me that doesn't want her to have the same experience that I had when I was a child.
Oof.
Right. So it's more a reflection of me consciously engaging my anger and my
Wow.
boundary setting, and doing it without fear, but without doing it in a healthy way, doing it in a conscious way. And I've just been very afraid of doing that because of my past
That is so
experiences as a
interesting.
child. Yeah.
Oh, that is really interesting, Greg. You've got me like actually thinking now about the last interaction I had where I yelled at my daughter or whatever else, and we try to hold back. And this gentle parenting movement that's come to be, there's all kinds of funny TikToks out there where it's like, hey, remember whenever you listened to your parents and you had very clear boundaries and you knew that you'd have consequences, and that's why you didn't misbehave or sneak out of the house or whatever? How's the gentle parenting thing working for you? And it's the same generation. It's all our age group of people who are circulating these videos. But I do think that the gentle parenting thing was born out of exactly what you're talking about. We don't want people to feel the way that we did when we were being yelled at as a kid. And that is still important. But now the pendulum has swung to a direction where nobody's setting boundaries. There are no boundaries on kids. You need to let them be kids. And there's a cost to that as well. And I think that you sort of sounds like you kind of learned that the hard way in this interaction with your partner.
Yeah. And also, what I've realized in myself just by engaging these relationship dynamics is when I shy away from my own anger, I shut down, I disconnect.
Yeah.
And shutting down and disconnecting is way more damaging in a relationship than actually expressing anger.
Mm.
So, at least when you're expressing anger, you're being honest, authentic, and staying engaged with the person. But if I'm afraid of my own anger, I'm going to disassociate from those parts of me and therefore disassociate from the relationship. And I think that's unhealthier than staying engaged, even though there might be some challenging emotions there. So that's something I'm also learning in myself,
Yeah.
um, learning the hard way.
Amazing. All right, Greg, let's get into Imago Dei, the Imago Dei archetype, the image of God.
So the image of God, the Imago Dei, is one of the most important archetypes to explore because of how much it informs from the back, right? It's constantly informing from the unconscious. And 99% of the time, we're not consciously aware that it's actually informing our choices, behaviors, belief systems. So if we take a look at, for example, the survival archetypes, how our image of God or our perception of that which we consider to be God or source influences all of the survival archetypes. For example, if you see God as kind of like this off-planet father figure, that very often is going to keep you in the child archetype, failing to take full self-responsibility.
Right.
Or if you still have this belief system that God's kind of like this like spiritual Santa Claus, where if I do good things, I get good things, but if I do bad things, I get bad things, that actually sets you up for the victim archetype. Because what happens when you do something good, but you don't get the reward you think you deserve? You feel victimized. Or if you get something that you don't want, but you don't feel like you did something to deserve it, that keeps you in the victim archetype. So that whole kind of like do good, get good, do bad, get bad kind of like reward punishment relationship with God sets up, like I said, that victim archetype.
Let me comment on that real quickly, because I actually think this is really critical, especially with what happened during the pandemic. And I know you're going to probably relate this to that. But, we're as far back as we can go in written human history. We had a very different cosmology. The cosmology was that God was within. God was within Earth. We are inextricably linked with nature, and therefore our planet, Tierra Madre, Gaia, Pachamama. I mean, these mythologies go way back before Christianity, and it wasn't until, and I did this episode 72 on a briefish history of Western medicine, witches and women healers, where I talk about this and how women who were even closer, even more intermeshed with nature, how in order to perhaps impose power and strip them of this inherent remembering of how powerful they are, we transitioned from deities that resided within us, within the earth, and transplanted them into the clouds, governing over Earth. And it's almost as if our entire society is constructed around a victim archetype, where there is something else out there that is going to save me, whether it's a politician, it's a priest, it's a doctor.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually done quite a bit of harm to our relationship with self and with the planet at large, but really even just how we communicate with other people. It's the scarcity mentality. It's the somebody needs to save me from myself, whether it's in birth, at the end of life, anywhere in between. So I want to just plug that in there, because what you're describing is actually far more profound and important for us to acknowledge if we want to see anything change in the world. This victim mentality, this victim archetype, it's not a blame and shame. It's not saying, hey, get over it, sweetheart. It's, we have to just acknowledge where we're at. And we are living in a society where there's always somebody else that has the answers for us. So I just want to plug that in there, but go on.
The victim is always looking to be rescued.
Right.
So the rescuer could be Jesus. The rescuer could be some medical intervention. It could be the doctor, right? So when you're playing the victim looking to be rescued, you're outsourcing your power.
Right.
You're not taking full self-responsibility. I love the just
Bingo.
saying that victimhood is anything less than full self-responsibility. I love when Paul Selig says you can't be a master and a victim at the same time.
Right.
Now this is not to completely reject the victim archetype, because they all serve a purpose. Like, for example, if you're in a marriage that you're being physically abused, to deny that you're a victim and to stay in the marriage would not be a good idea. So the light side of the victim is to really acknowledge when you're being victimized and to take action, right? To take action, to set a boundary, right? That's the empowered victim that becomes the victor.
I also wanted to go back to something you had said earlier about this relationship we have with our parents, because I think ultimately, if we're not able to heal these wounds and stand in our own power and perhaps just recognize where we came from, who we are, and where we want to go, that the ultimate victim archetype actually is something that was impressed upon us even in our relationship with our parents. And I think the way a lot of people have shown up in the world, even during the pandemic, was somebody out there's got the answer for me. And that first person who had all the answers was your parents. So in a lot of ways, and this is to steal a little bit from Paul Chek, like we've got a lot of children walking around in adult bodies, but they haven't actually embraced adulthood, which requires you to accept the outcomes of your decisions if you're going to claim any autonomy over the way you show up in the world and where you're headed. Absolutely.
And so we talked about the child, the victim in relationship to the Imago Dei. So the saboteur, our perception or relationship of what God is leads to a lot of self-sabotage. For example, a lot of people who were taught in their religion that they're always supposed to be selfless and they're always supposed to be doing for others.
Oh, I'm so glad you're saying that.
They should not be taking care of themselves. There's so much self-sabotage in that belief system. So the saboteur is so woven into the religious institution, not that it's always bad, but you can see very clearly, and we can also explore the pandemic, how these survival archetypes are woven in. The prostitute is also very interesting, where, for me on my archetype wheel, I have the prostitute in the house of spirituality, which has been a very interesting thing to explore, because the prostitute's all about compromise and negotiation. And also the prostitute is always like looking for a guarantee. And spirituality is a lot about stepping into the unknown. And the prostitute does not like the unknown. It likes safety and security. So what I've explored within myself is where my prayer life or the way I talk to God is a form of negotiation. And how much like people's prayer becomes, God, if you give me this, I promise I'll do this. There's the prostitute archetype.
There it is. Yeah. I mean, God, right? That's modern, that's contemporary religion, especially through the lens of Catholicism and Protestantism.
Yeah. It's compromise, negotiation, and always looking for a guarantee or some sort of transaction that benefits you in some way. So there's how the prostitute shows up in relationship to God. So there's the 4 survival archetypes in relationship to the Imago Dei.
I love that, Greg. You're very, very thoughtful about these things. What do you think? We've really kind of already said this, and I don't really care to even talk about COVID anymore, but when you were given your interpretation of some of these themes, when you saw things that were happening during the pandemic, this is not a matter of masks or no masks, vaccine, no vaccine, lockdown, whatever. I'm sure that nobody cares about that. When you were seeing how policies were being made, how people were turning to the news and whatnot, can you maybe elaborate in a couple sentences just what you saw happening through the lens of some of these survival archetypes?
Sure. So if we look at the evolution of COVID, we start with kind of like this big bad wolf that's out to get you. And we're told you need to stay home, you need to socially distance. And that triggers the victim archetype.
Right.
Like we're the victims here, we're under attack, we have to hide. Like there's just victim archetype to start. And then there's the authority, whatever you want to consider to be the authority that is telling you what to do. And most people are kind of like sitting and waiting for commands of like, can I do this or can I do that? Should I do this? Should I not do that? Should I take this and not that? So there's the outsourcing of the power of choice, which is the child archetype. And then there's all of this fear that's being instilled, like just pumping of the energy of fear through social media and the news. And fear is what activates the saboteur archetype. So all of a sudden we start sabotaging freedoms and constitutional rights and all of these things that we hold so dear to us. As soon as fear hits, we're ready to sabotage it for
Right.
safety, security, and survival. So you see the evolution of the victim, the child, the saboteur, and the prostitute is really also our way of negotiating our values. I think
Yeah.
we moved very far away from our values, like what our country is based on and built on. Like our value structure was totally abandoned. And you
Mm.
also saw that, the prostitute archetype is a lot about abandoning values for financial gain, right? So obviously you can look at like the pharmaceutical industry and the politics, like where there's a lot of sabotaging of values for financial incentives and financial gain. So that's a very easy way to see the prostitute archetype.
Hmm.
So those four survival archetypes, understandably so, came out immediately when COVID hit because
Yeah.
COVID shifted everyone into survival mode, which is why they're called survival archetypes.
It's really funny that that happened too, because up until 2019 into 2020, we'll look at pharmaceutical companies in general. And I don't want to get like too much in the weeds on this, but I think it is really you're making me very thoughtful about this. Prior to that, people were distrustful of pharmaceutical companies, especially Pfizer, Bayer, the big ones, and they were distrustful because they didn't feel like they were being cared for, that their best interests were being kept in mind. What does it tell us about this 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 tendency that we have to fall into the survival archetype? Like it does serve us, but how could this happen on such a massive scale for so many, but others didn't? Like what was the differentiator between the people that fell into that survival, that victim mentality, and those that didn't? I mean, do you have any gesticulation on that? I'm kind of curious about
I
that.
think there's a couple things. I think one of the biggest ones is what we started with is I think people that had a sense of purpose stayed anchored in their purpose.
Hmm.
Where I think was it JP Sears? Like very early on, he said like the best way to avoid panic is to stay anchored in purpose.
Hmm.
And to wake up every day with a sense of purpose or mission, that makes it a lot easier to not get swept away by the chaos. So I think that's one thing. I think also our relationship with death in our culture is probably like the biggest factor that showed up because if we're talking about survival archetypes, most people's relationship or belief systems around death really dictate their relationship with the survival archetypes, right? If you think that, the death of the physical body is like the end, just like lights out, then you're going to do absolutely everything you possibly can to ensure the survival of your
Mm.
physical body,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
survival of just like maintaining the status quo. Because
Yeah.
if it's lights out, then there's nothing else, So I think the myth around death is probably the biggest driving factor that made us so susceptible to that.
I
I think,
agree
yeah,
100%.
yeah.
Hmm.
So those are the two things that come to mind. I love like the term age regression, where
Mm.
like whenever you get triggered, like you revert back to like some aspect of you that is 7 years old or 8 years old. Or
Right.
so I love like when these archetypes come up, like to ask yourself the question, like, how old do I feel when I'm acting this way? Like, how old do I feel when this pattern takes me over? And then what you realize is like that age was kind of like the introduction to that archetype of like, oh, this is the first time I played the victim for the first time. This is when I self sabotaged for the first time. This is when I prostituted myself for the first time. So I think it gives us a beautiful opportunity to reclaim and recover those aspects of ourself that
Mm.
we still regress back to because they're still pulling us back because they need us to bring them forward. So I
That is
think
so
it's,
interesting.
yeah, I think it has to happen that way, because you can't move forward in life, in growth, in spirituality, if there's still parts of that child inside of you that are still wounded, unhealed, unresolved. Like there's like this tether that keeps pulling you back. It's kind of like the child archetype is like the gatekeeper that prevents you from entering the kingdom if you haven't fully recovered and reclaimed him or her yet.
Yeah. Well, since we're coming to the end of the interview, but since
Mhm.
we have talked a little bit about wounding as a child, I know one point we did kind of throw around pre-recording was talking about childhood trauma,
Uh-huh.
and with the word trauma is loaded because it's first off not really a safe bet to compare traumas. Although I think some people would say there are certain things in life that seem unforgivably traumatic to a child.
Sure. Sure.
Molestation, seeing your parents die violently. I mean, we could create a big list of things. However, I think that trauma also shows up in more
Subtle.
subversive's not the word, but yeah, a little bit more occult. Like it's a little insidious that something
Yeah.
happened, and
Yeah.
through maybe some regression therapy or whatever you might get into it. But I think many of us are carrying some degree of trauma, and
Mhm.
um, so my final question and exploration with you, Greg, is if a person has identified that it's something may have happened at age, before the age of 10, let's say, maybe 4 or 5 years old, is there any advice that you could give? I know that you're not a psychotherapist necessarily, but you are very thoughtful about these things. What advice would you give to somebody who is trapped in a survival archetype based on something very real and very traumatizing that happened when they were a kid?
Two things come to mind. The first is, I love Gabor Mate's work.
Love it.
I've taken a lot of his courses, and I love how Gabor talks about trauma as it's not what happened to you, it's what you perceived,
Yeah.
right? And also differentiating feelings from perceptions.
Mm.
And, for example, if I look back at my childhood, I was a competitive golfer when I was much younger, and I would be playing golf tournaments, and my dad would walk the course, as I was playing. And I remember many times when I started to not play well, my dad would leave and just wait in the clubhouse for when I finished.
He didn't want to see
And
it.
and at the time, what I perceived was when I don't perform well, dad abandons me. But
Hmm.
years later, I inquired about that and I asked him, and what he said was, I figured and I thought that if you weren't playing well, that you wouldn't want me there.
Oh my
So I
gosh.
I left because I didn't think that you would want me watching you if you weren't performing well, if you were struggling. So in
Same
reality, he would,
experience, very,
yep,
very, it's like looking at the same flower bouquet on the table, but on your side, you've got a couple more red flowers. He's got a couple other yellow flowers. You're seeing the
uh-huh,
same bouquet, but just from a different direction.
exactly.
Wow.
So I developed a perfectionist mentality, like um a really intense like work ethic. Like I always had to achieve
Hmm.
at the highest level because there was a part of me that believed that if I don't, people abandon me. My father abandons me. So that's where trauma is very simply how you perceived an event. So that's number one, is like being
Whoa.
able to like compassionately inquire about your perceptions and if they're really true and if there's other possibilities. Like Gabor talks about like his mother like handing him off when he's 6 months old because she was taken by the Nazis and he thought he was being abandoned when she was actually saving his life. So trauma really being 100% about perception. And
Yeah.
the second component is, I work with a lot of trauma. I work with a lot of clients that have, sexual abuse, a lot of abandonment, a lot of really challenging stuff. And I think too many people put too much pressure on themselves to forgive the person.
Right.
that may have traumatized them, or the perpetrator, so to speak. And what I tell people, and I learned this from Matt Kahn, who's one of my favorite teachers.
What's
And
his name? Matt
Matt
Kahn?
Kahn, yeah, Kahn, he's amazing. And he said something once in a workshop about forgiveness, and he said, you don't have to ever forgive the other person for what they've done to you. The only thing that you have to forgive is the story you created about yourself as a result of what
That's
happened to you.
so powerful.
So the only thing that I invite people to look at is, what's the narrative you created about yourself as a result of the trauma?
Mm.
Let's just work with that narrative. And when you forgive the story, whether it's a story of unworthiness or unlovability or self judgment or whatever it is, once you forgive the narrative, the story, then you actually heal the trauma, because that's what you're carrying with you. Like, sure, you know, you're carrying some of it in your body, right? So that's where like the somatic experiencing is really helpful. But what's attached to that is the narrative. And the narrative is what creates the archetypal contract of, from the moment of that trauma, now I'm going to be the perfectionist. Now I'm going to be the judge. Now I'm going to take on the inner critic, because that's what I need to do to survive. So those are the two things. There's, the perception of trauma, and then forgiving the narrative that you created about yourself, rather than trying to forgive the other person, which never really goes anywhere.
That is so powerful. That is a really, really great way to wrap this interview up. I'm gonna have to look into Matt Kahn's work, because this is actually so relevant for me. As you know, I do a lot of birth work, and I also attend a lot of death. But in the birth space, people don't understand that. In my definition of not definition, my understanding of trauma is any stressor in your life that's not well integrated thereafter
Mm-hmm.
can be
Mm-hmm.
stored up and snowball and become a tremendously traumatic thing, after the event, and a lot of us live with that until we die. And so when a person comes to me and they describe their birth as having been really traumatic, you expect, like, oh, there was alarms going off and blood was spraying everywhere, but it could have been a totally normal, healthy mom, healthy baby. Everything seems fine, but something didn't feel right.
Mm-hmm.
And then you find out that somebody did a vaginal exam without introducing themselves, or they said no to the vaginal exam, but the doctor did it anyway. I mean, it's these little, I don't want to call them microaggressions, because that term has been used elsewhere, but there are these little things that we maybe, as the perpetrators, so to speak, don't realize was harmful. But the story about that is told is that I wasn't respected. I wasn't heard. They didn't care about me. They didn't think, it was because of my skin color. Whatever reason, this person harmed me, and here's why they did it. Whereas this person who did it may have not even realized they were doing something wrong, there is an important distinction there. And so, in working through women who have had these traumatic experiences, even if it was not all that crazy of a birth, it was just the typical baby comes out, healthy mom, healthy baby, whatever. It is so helpful to get them to appreciate. I do a lot of birth storytelling. And when they tell that story, oftentimes they are stuck in exactly the same way that you're describing it for kids. And that's not to say that you're being childlike. It's to say that these patterns are things that we have been modeled to us and that we've experienced in the past. And when we take on that victim mentality and create these stories, it had never occurred to me that it's not a matter of forgiveness. Who cares about the person who did it? What
Yeah.
story have you told yourself? That's actually the thing you have control over. And I'm gonna borrow some of this from you, Greg. Do you work with men and women?
Yes.
Have you ever had anybody who's talked to you about traumatic birth or anything like that? Because I'd love to be able to send people your way. It might be really helpful to them.
Not off the top of my head in terms of traumatic birth, but obviously a lot of childhood trauma, a lot of, even I've worked with a lot of parents who've lost children. So obviously that's a big trauma. But I work with a lot of trauma around like just early childhood, on the child side, on the parent side. Like
Sure.
there's so much that happens in those years. So that's really where I've spent a lot of my time, but a little bit less in the birth process itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, you might have a new niche here, Greg. I might be sending people your way because that is it's almost 100% of the people who are struggling to get pregnant. I end up through getting to know them. I start to unveil, and not even just fertility, pregnancy. It's also like I've got these issues, and when you look back and do some biographical work, you're like, oh, something happened in your early years, and they've kind of repressed it because they don't know what else to do with it. Which I don't blame them. It can be very painful to relive that over and over. But what if there was a way to reframe it for them and help them retell that story? That's really powerful work. So perhaps you and I maybe could even come up with that niche together, and I would just
Absolutely.
filter people your way because the work you're doing with archetypes, I think, is so can be so profoundly impactful, and it's not that hard. It's really a matter of working through it in a systematic way and finding the language in order to show up in a respectful, compassionate, and open-minded way. So Greg, thank you. Thank you so much for illuminating me. I'm sure people are going to love this episode. They're going to want to find more. So you talked about some of your programs in the beginning. Let's finish off with that. What do you want people to know about in the event that they want more Greg Schmaus?
Yeah, so if they want to reach out to me directly, my website is healing4d.com, and that's the number 4d.com. And my 21-day online program, Healing the Mind, A Journey to Wholeness, that's at healing4d.com/HTM. And you'll have a link um, for that in the show notes. And if they use that link and use the code podcast20, they can save 20% off for the
Great.
21-day program. And then on social media, I'm on Instagram 4D Healing. And then I just recently started a YouTube page, which is just my name. So they can find me on YouTube as well, where each week I'll post a little bit of content as well.
That's awesome, brother. We're going to try to get people your way. I really, really appreciate what you're doing in the world. And I know things have probably been a little bit slow moving. It's also a kind of it's everybody's kind of in a down point right now with their businesses because it's this time of year before Christmas and all of that. But I also want to acknowledge and honor that I think as a man, going through what you've gone through and coming into this space with a very unique skill set and approach to some very important things, I think it's what everybody I would hope would have the courage to do. I know that what you're doing has taken a lot of courage given everything we've learned about you. So I do want to just say, man to man, friend to friend, like you're doing the good work. Just keep it up. And I'm going to try to support you in every way that I can.
I appreciate that. And thank you so much for all the work that you're doing and for having me on the show today.
Totally. All right. We'll send people your way, Greg. Thanks again.
Thanks.